As lightning tore the night sky into pieces, somewhere in a distant field under the monotonous roar of rain lay a horse. He was abandoned, exhausted, and his once proud, powerful legs now lay helplessly sprawled. His coat glistened with water streaming down his body, and his eyes were full of despair. Once, he had been a champion, the best in his field, but tonight he was nothing more than a shadow of his former glory. The horse was covered in scars from numerous competitions, and his body bore the marks of harsh training. His leg, which once effortlessly cleared the highest barriers, was now injured, and pain shot through his entire body. His heavy breathing mingled with the sound of the rain trickling down his face, and each breath came with immense effort. Deep down, he felt that this might be his last night, but even more terrifying was the fact that he had been abandoned by the one he trusted. Another lightning bolt split the darkness, and for a moment, the horse saw his surroundings, an endless rain-soaked plain, empty and hopeless. Water ran down his sides, mixing with mud, and he felt his strength waning with each passing second. He was weary, and his thoughts grew increasingly blurred. He recalled moments of his glory, when he stood on the podium surrounded by a cheering crowd, every movement full of energy and vitality. But now all of that seemed like a distant dream. When it seemed that hope had long abandoned this poor creature, someone appeared next to him, a farmer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes but a kind heart. Farmer George, a man more accustomed to potatoes and tractors than champion horses. His old pickup truck, called Betsy, had stopped right on the road where the horse lay. "What have we got here?" George muttered, wiping his brow with his sleeve as he tried to peer through the rain. He saw the outline of the horse, and his heart tightened with compassion. "You sure look a sight, buddy." George approached the horse, knelt down, and saw his large eyes filled with pain and fear. The horse looked at him as if he were the last hope, but still couldn't trust the human. His gaze was clouded, and there was so much despair in his eyes that George felt his heart clench. "Don't worry, I won't hurt you," the farmer said, kneeling down and gently examining the injured leg. He saw traces of blood that had already clotted on the wound and knew that if he didn't help the horse now, the consequences could be fatal. "I've got something better than this mud back home. A warm place, hay, maybe even some carrots. What do you say, huh?" The horse, of course, didn't respond, but there was something new in his eyes. Perhaps it was a glimmer of hope. George noticed it and decided that he wouldn't leave the animal. He returned to the pickup, took out a blanket, and began gently lifting the horse. It wasn't easy, as the horse weighed several hundred kilograms, and each movement required effort. But George was a man with a determined heart. He used all his strength, propping up the animal and supporting it with each of his movements. Finally, the horse was safely on Betsy's bed, and the farmer headed toward his farm. The road was challenging. The rain had turned the dirt road into a complete bog, and the pickup got stuck in the mud more than once, but George kept going, persisting. He knew he couldn't stop, that the horse needed help, and that every minute mattered. Waiting for George at the farm was his wife, Sarah, who was always ready for unexpected situations. She saw her husband driving up to the house and quickly noticed that this time he wasn't bringing a regular load of hay or a broken plow. The distant rumble of the motor, and the sight of old Betsy moving slowly under the rain sparked her curiosity. "George, what have you done this time?" she said, crossing her arms over her chest, though her voice already carried concern. Sarah knew her husband and understood that he couldn't remain indifferent to someone else's pain. "Sarah, it's a horse," George replied, peeking out from behind the pickup door. He was exhausted, soaked to the bone, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "He's injured. A champion, if the markings are to be believed. I just couldn't leave him there." Sarah sighed but stepped closer, seeing the horse's large eyes, full of pain and humility, and her heart melted. She gently extended her hand, and the horse slightly lowered his head, feeling her warmth. His heavy breathing calmed a bit as he felt her touch. "Well then, let's do what we can," she said, already walking toward the stable. "But remember, George, this was your idea." And he'll be taking up half of our kitchen until he gets better." The farmer smiled, knowing he had won this little battle. Together, they carefully led the horse out of the pickup and took him to the stable, where warm hay and fresh water awaited him. The stable was small but cozy, and for the injured champion, it was the best place to rest. "Here we go," George murmured as the horse carefully lay down on the bedding. "It's not a champion's arena, but it'll do for now." Sarah handed George a bowl of warm water and a towel, and they began treating the wounds gently. The farmer's hands, which so often held rough tools, were now filled with tenderness as George tended to the injured champion. Sarah helped him, gently washing the wounds and applying bandages. They worked together in silence, each lost in their thoughts, and with each passing minute, they felt an invisible bond forming between them and the animal. "George, look at this," Sarah said, pointing at the markings on the horse's side. "He was definitely a champion. These symbols mean he won several important competitions." George looked at the markings and once again felt a surge of determination. He knew that this was not just an animal before him, but a creature that had endured many trials and deserved a second chance. "You're safe now, buddy," George said quietly, stroking the horse's head again. "We'll do everything we can to get you back on your feet." The horse closed his eyes, and his breathing became more even. He felt the warmth and care of these people, and perhaps for the first time in a long while, he was able to sleep peacefully. But somewhere far away, in a cozy office where neither rain nor pain could be seen, the antagonist of this story, Mr. Wilkins, sat, basking in his victory. He knew that the horse he had abandoned no longer held any value for him. Wilkins was a man driven solely by success and money, and when the horse failed to bring in another trophy, he became useless. "Well, another failed project," Wilkins said, snapping his fingers at his secretary, who brought him another cup of coffee. He didn't look her in the eye, his gaze fixed on the documents on his desk, where plans for a new champion were already being developed. "I need a new horse, stronger and younger." The secretary only nodded, jotting down his words, but there was a hint of surprise in her eyes. She had worked with Wilkins for a long time and knew his attitude toward animals. To him, they were merely tools, and if a tool became useless, it was replaced without remorse. But something in her heart told her that this story wasn't over yet. Mr. Wilkins had no idea that his decision to abandon the injured champion would become his greatest mistake. He was consumed by his ambitions, oblivious to the fact that true strength and greatness are not always measured by victories and medals. And somewhere, in a cozy stable, an injured horse who had found a new home was given a chance for recovery and, perhaps, a new beginning that would change not only his life but also the lives of those who decided to help him. At dawn, the farm was bathed in soft, warm light that pierced through the thin clouds still lingering in the sky after the night's storm. In the stable, it was quiet, and all that could be heard was the breathing of the horse, who slept peacefully on the soft bedding. George and Sarah woke up early, as they always did. Their usual morning chores awaited them, but this time they had one more task in their lives, taking care of the wounded champion. "Sarah, I'm going to the stable to check on our guest," George said, pulling on his old jacket. He looked tired, but there was hope in his eyes. "All right, just don't forget to give him some water," replied Sarah, standing by the kitchen table and preparing breakfast. She didn't show it, but she was also concerned about the horse's condition. They both knew that a tough journey lay ahead. George entered the stable and saw the horse lift his head to meet his gaze. The despair that George had seen in the horse's eyes yesterday was no longer there. Now there was something different, perhaps a hint of trust, a small glimmer of hope that could be the beginning of recovery. "Hello, buddy," George said, cautiously approaching the horse. He extended his hand with a bucket of water and placed it beside the bedding. The horse slowly lowered his head and began to drink, as if sensing that the water would help restore his strength. "That's it, good boy," George murmured. "Drink up, you need it." George began to gently inspect the wounds to make sure the night had passed without complications. The wound on the horse's leg looked better, the blood had clotted, and it was now crucial to ensure no infections developed. George once again cleaned the wound with warm water and applied a fresh bandage, trying to be as careful as possible. Afterward, he took a few carrots that Sarah had left for the horse and gently offered one to the animal. The horse slowly took the carrot and began to chew, and for a moment George thought he saw something like gratitude in his eyes. "Good boy," the farmer said, stroking the horse's neck. "You know, you deserve a second chance, and I'll do everything I can to help you get it." Days passed, and George and Sarah cared for the wounded champion every day. The horse gradually regained his strength, his breathing became more even, and his eyes began to shine with life. Every day, George would take the horse out into the yard, allowing him to walk and feel the ground beneath his hooves. At first, it was just a few cautious and hesitant steps, but with each passing day, the horse grew stronger. George often talked to the horse during these walks, telling him about life on the farm, about how hard it was to work, but how rewarding it was to see the results of one's labor. He spoke of his hopes and dreams, of how he wanted the horse to feel joy in what he did once again. And though the horse couldn't respond, he listened, and a special bond gradually formed between them. Sarah, who had initially doubted they could save the animal, now approached the stable more and more often, bringing the horse treats and talking to him. She understood that this horse was more than just an animal. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even after the darkest times, there is always a chance for a new beginning. She would sit beside him for hours, watching as he slowly recovered, and she would tell him about her childhood, about how she had always dreamed of having a horse of her own. One day, when the sun had already risen high in the sky, George decided it was time to try something more. He opened the stable door and, gently taking the horse by the bridle, led him out to the meadow. The meadow was vast, covered in green grass that swayed gently in the breeze. The horse stopped, inhaled the fresh air, and looked at the open space before him. "Well, buddy," George said, patting the horse's neck. "This is your time. Try to walk a little." The horse slowly took a step forward, then another. He felt the grass under his hooves, and it was an amazing feeling, to feel like part of the world again, not just a forgotten creature. George walked beside him, not letting go of the bridle, supporting the horse in case he struggled. But with each step, the horse grew more confident, his stride becoming steadier. Suddenly, the horse stopped and looked at George, as if asking for permission to do more. George smiled and said softly, "You want to try, don't you?" "All right, I trust you." He gently let go of the bridle, and the horse took a few more steps before suddenly breaking into a run. His movements were still awkward, but he was running. He felt the freedom he cherished so much, and he felt his strength slowly returning. Sarah, who stood on the porch of the house watching everything, felt tears well up in her eyes. It was a miracle, a true miracle that she and George had brought to life with their own hands. The horse ran across the meadow, then stopped, turned to George, and neighed loudly. It was the first neigh since he had arrived with them, and it was a symbol of his rebirth. George approached the horse, hugged his neck, and whispered softly, "Well done, buddy. Now I know you can do it." They spent several more hours in the meadow. The horse, whom George now called Lucky, roamed the grass, grazing freely and exploring the surroundings. George and Sarah sat on the hill, watching him and talking about their future. They knew there would be a lot of work ahead, but they felt that this horse had become part of their family, and they were ready to do whatever it took to make him happy. Somewhere far away, in a luxurious office, Mr. Wilkins was signing contracts for new horses. He was investing large sums in his next project, paying no attention to his previous mistakes. He believed that success was merely a matter of investment and control, failing to understand that true value lay in dedication and care. The secretary, who always silently followed his orders, one day decided to find out more about the horse that Wilkins had so easily abandoned. She found information about George Farm and decided to write them a letter to find out what had happened to the animal. She felt that this story must have a happy ending, and she wanted to be sure of it. She wrote a simple, short letter, expressing her admiration for George and Sarah's courage and asking if the horse was still with them and how he was doing. The letter arrived at the farm a few days later, and when George read it, he smiled. "Sarah, look at this," he said, showing the letter to his wife. "People are interested in our champion." Sarah read the letter and felt proud. She and George had done something important, and their story had inspired others. She looked at George and said quietly, "Maybe we didn't just save the horse. Maybe we showed that there's always a chance for a new beginning, no matter how hard the path has been." George nodded in agreement. He looked at the meadow where their horse now grazed peacefully and felt warmth spread through his heart. He knew that their champion would amaze them with his strength and courage again, and that many trials lay ahead, but now he was ready for anything. That evening, they all gathered near the stable. George, Sarah, and Lucky. Sarah brought a blanket, and they sat on the ground, enjoying the cool evening air. Lucky stood nearby, his head lowered, and George gently stroked his neck. "We did it, buddy," George said, looking at the starry sky. "We made it through the tough times, and now everything will be okay." Sarah smiled, leaning against her husband's shoulder. They knew there would still be a lot of work ahead, but now they were a team. And their team had grown even stronger because of what they had done together. The revival of hope is not just words. It's the actions we take every day, step by step, giving all we have to those in need. Sometimes these actions are small and almost invisible, but they make a huge difference to those who receive them. And that is what makes their efforts worth everything. They sat together, looking at the stars, and each of them felt that the future promised to be bright and full of new possibilities. And despite all the difficulties, they knew that together they could overcome any obstacles. Months passed, and George and Sarah's farm was filled with life and routine work that became more and more familiar. Lucky, the horse who had once been on the brink of death, was now fully integrated into their family. His leg, which had once been injured, had healed so well that he could run across the meadow again, demonstrating his skills, albeit without the former blazing speed. But to George and Sarah, he was more than just a champion. He was a symbol of their struggle and triumph over hardship. One day, while George was working in the field, Sarah came to him, carrying some papers in her hands. Her face was worried, and she seemed pensive. "George, take a look at this," she said, handing him the papers. "It's a letter from Mr. Wilkins. He is offering to buy Lucky from us." George paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, and took the papers. He quickly skimmed through the text and visibly frowned. The offer was generous. Wilkins was willing to pay a significant amount to get the horse back, but George knew this wasn't just about money. "He thinks he can bring him back to his former glory," George said, throwing the papers to the ground. "But Lucky is no longer a competition horse. He deserves a peaceful life, without harsh training and competitions." "I think so too," Sarah replied, looking at her husband. "But we have to be prepared for the fact that Wilkins won't stop. He might start causing us trouble." George sighed and nodded. He knew that Mr. Wilkins was not used to hearing no. His ambition and thirst for success did not allow him to accept defeat. But George and Sarah were determined not to give up Lucky. Days turned into weeks, and George and Sarah continued their life on the farm, but the tension grew. They knew that Wilkins had not forgotten about his offer, and one day their fears became reality. Representatives of Wilkins arrived at the farm, 2 men in business suits with cold looks in their eyes. They brought another letter, this time with legal threats. "Mr. George," one of the men began, "we are here to discuss the return of the horse that belongs to Mr. Wilkins. We believe he has full rights to this animal." George stood on the doorstep of his house, clenching his fists. Sarah stood next to him, feeling her heart beat faster. "Lucky no longer belongs to Mr. Wilkins," George said firmly. "He abandoned him when the horse was on the verge of life and death. We saved Lucky, and now he is part of our family." "We understand your emotions," the man replied coldly, "but Mr. Wilkins is willing to pay a significant amount to get his horse back. If you refuse, we will be forced to take this to court." Sarah sighed and glanced at Lucky, who was peacefully grazing in the meadow. She knew they couldn't let this happen. Lucky deserved a better life, and they were ready to fight for him. "We won't give him up," she said, looking directly into the representative's eyes. He is no longer yours, and no amount of money will make us change our decision." The men exchanged glances, and one of them shrugged. "Then you leave us with few options," he said, turning back to the car. "We will inform Mr. Wilkins of your refusal. Be prepared for the consequences." George and Sarah watched as the car drove away, leaving a cloud of dust behind. They knew this was just the beginning. But they also knew that they wouldn't give up without a fight. Lucky was not just a horse to them, he was a symbol of hope, a reminder that true value isn't measured in money. The evening on the farm was quiet, but the tension was palpable. George sat on the porch, looking out at the meadow where Lucky was grazing, seemingly unaware of what was happening. Sarah came out of the house, holding 2 cups of tea, and sat down next to her husband. "Well, get through this, George," she said softly, handing him a cup. "We've always faced challenges, and this time won't be any different." George nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on Lucky. "I know, Sarah," he said. "But it hurts me to think that someone might try to take him away from us. He deserves peace, and I won't let him be subjected to harsh training again." Sarah smiled and placed her hand on his shoulder. "We're in this together, and we'll find a way to protect him," she said. "We'll reach out to everyone who can help us. We're not alone in this fight." The next day, George and Sarah decided to reach out to neighbors and friends for support. They shared their story, how they had found Lucky, cared for him, and how he had become part of their lives. Their story quickly spread among the local residents, and many people decided to support them in this fight. One day, a group of journalists arrived at the farm. They wanted to hear Lucky's story firsthand. George and Sarah agreed to give an interview, telling how they had found the horse, how they had cared for him, and how he had recovered thanks to their care and love. Lucky was abandoned, George told the journalists. He was nothing to his former owner. But to us, he became part of our family, and we won't allow him to be used again. The story quickly gained popularity. People began reaching out to George and Sarah, offering their support. They received letters from strangers expressing admiration for their determination and dedication. Many local residents came to the farm to see Lucky and support them in their fight. Mr. Wilkins, upon learning of the publicity, was furious. He had not expected his attempt to reclaim the horse would trigger such a reaction. But now, with his name being mentioned in a negative context, he was forced to reconsider his actions. He couldn't afford to lose his reputation over a single horse. One evening, as the sun was setting over the horizon, another car arrived at the farm. A man in a suit got out, but this time he looked less confident. He approached George and Sarah, who were standing by the stable, and greeted them politely. "My name is Robert. I represent Mr. Wilkins," he began. "Mr. Wilkins would like to settle this matter peacefully. He will no longer claim Lucky and is ready to sign all the necessary documents to officially relinquish his rights." George and Sarah exchanged glances, and their faces lit up with relieved smiles. They knew this was a victory, not only for them but also for Lucky. "We agree," George said. "Lucky will stay with us, and we thank you for deciding to make the right choice." Robert nodded and handed over the documents for signing. George signed them, feeling a heavy burden lift from his shoulders. Lucky was free, and now no one could take him away from them. That evening, George, Sarah, and Lucky gathered in the meadow once again. They watched as the horse ran under the starry sky, free and happy. Sarah leaned against George, and they both felt that their struggle had not been in vain. "We did it," Sarah said softly. "Lucky will stay with us forever." "Yes," George replied, hugging her. "He's ours, and we'll always take care of him." They stood together, looking at their horse, knowing that many happy moments lay ahead. Lucky was a symbol of their strength, their dedication, and the fact that true value lies not in money, but in the love and care we give to others. It was a test of strength, but they had endured. And now their farm was not just a place of work, it was a home where there was always room for love, hope, and faith in a better future.